I've been having a lot of fun reconstructing the historical clothing from various regions around the world, and I finally presented the research on my ancestors, which I have quite a strong connection with, the Volgo-Tatars. I was partially raised by my Tatar grandmother. On my paternal side though, I have an Irish grandparent, so I've been fascinated by Irish historical clothing for a while now. For instance, a few years back, I reconstructed the 19th century working class clothing of an Irish woman. And by the way, if I sound a little funny today, it's because I'm recovering from an illness, and so I'm at the end where my voice is very hoarse and everything is sort of settling down, but still not really. This time around, I thought 16th century Irish clothing would be a wonderfully educational project, as well as a period that's enough in my comfort zone that I feel like I can add other layers of more complexity, but still far enough outside of my comfort zone that it still feels fresh and different than what I've done before. I haven't explored the 16th century all of that much, actually. I've mostly been doing 14th century reconstruction and some other periods here and there, so it felt really exciting to tap into this new period. So naturally, I didn't just throw some clothes together and call it a day. My project began with a lot of research. As with many colonized cultures, there isn't a ton of information out there about Irish historical fashion, but thankfully there is some. There are some brilliant textile historians as well as reconstructors of 16th century Irish clothing, and these sources I've linked in the description down below. Although this is my own summary of some of the research that I found on the topic, I learned a lot from the inspiring individuals that have written on this topic, so please do go and check out their work as well to learn more. Garments for Irish men and women vary a bit. Both begin with an undergarment called a léine, which is the Irish word for shirt. It essentially serves as a similar purpose to a shift or a smock, as you find in other regions throughout the world during this time period. The léine is quite well known even in present-day Ireland, and it is still worn by some people, except there are quite a few misconceptions about the garment, and it tends to be made in a very modernized way. In Ireland, the soil is too acidic for linen to survive the decay of time, so because of this, no material finds of the léine exist. The information mostly available is some primary source writing from the 16th century, as well as a series of illustrations known as the de Heere prints. Lucas de Heere was a Flemish painter in the Tudor period, and he was known for contributing a tremendous amount of Tudor paintings of people. If you're interested in reconstructing Tudor fashion, you've likely seen his work. As M. Dunlevy states in chapter 3 of Dress in Ireland, in the 16th century, during the reign of 4 Tudor sovereigns, Ireland was effectively brought under direct English rule, from page 43. As Ireland was colonized by the English, and in fact that still has a negative effect to this day, in the 16th century, quite a bit of Irish fashion is influenced by English Tudor fashion, though Ireland maintains some of its traditional garments as well in an impressive act of resistance. In Dress in Ireland, Dunlevy writes, "In the 16th century, it was considered that a country was conquered only when the vanquished acknowledged and accepted the law, dress, language, and mores of the victors. The English found the resistance of the Irish to these changes disturbing, synonymous with opposition, while for the Irish, the retention of individual dress styles was a statement of a local pride and confidence," from page 46. De Heere is commissioned to paint the outfits of Irish people because at this point the English believed Ireland was a place where a bunch of quote-unquote uncivilized people were living, who required civilizing, and so the clothing and appearance of individuals also needed to be documented. Obviously, I highly disagree with the idea that 16th century Irish people were uncivilized. Quite the opposite, in fact. But as a result, we have a few depictions of Irish clothing during this period. One of the very unfortunate results of the English colonizing the Irish is the loss of the Irish language. In 2021, UNESCO's Atlas of World Languages described the Irish language as, quote, definitely endangered. In fact, some linguists predict that it may completely disappear in the next century. I'm someone that loves to help preserve endangered handicrafts, but I also feel the same about endangered and vulnerable languages. I know a fair bit of Icelandic, and I'm constantly still learning more, and I've been learning the Tatar language as well. So in addition to sewing 16th century Irish clothing, I also wanted to learn a little more Irish because I think it's one of the most beautiful languages in the world. And I've admired Irish traditional music for a long time, so I felt it was time to finally get to know some more words. Since I have an Irish grandparent, it also feels meaningful to me on an ancestral level to reconnect with the Irish language. Thanks to the partner of this video, Rosetta Stone, I've been able to learn a little Irish, and I'm excited to continue expanding my knowledge. Rosetta Stone is a language learning program that uses a dynamic immersion method which mimics the way that we all learned languages as children. They help you to go from just learning the new language to actually thinking in the language. Every person has a different way of learning new languages, and I know that the most impactful way for myself is by consuming art, whether that's in the form of music, movies, or stories. That's why one of the features I love is Rosetta Stone's Stories feature, which has original tales written in your language of choice. Each immersive lesson can be as short as 5 minutes, meaning that their language learning options can fit into your life, even if you have a very busy schedule. You can follow Rosetta Stone's lessons on your desktop, but if you're on the go, Rosetta Stone has a really wonderful and simple to use mobile app. And their audio companion lets you stream downloadable audio tracks that are related to the unit that you're learning. I love to practice Irish when I'm on the train or in bed just after I've woken up and before I fully start my day. This holiday season, for all of November and December, Rosetta Stone has their holiday promotion prices, with their single language deal costing $99 or just $149 for a lifetime subscription. With the exclusive link in my bio or by scanning the QR code here on screen, you can access all 25 languages from Rosetta Stone for over 60% off an unlimited language lifetime subscription, meaning that there's one payment for lifetime access. And if you're looking for a gift that immerses and inspires, one amazing option would be to give someone the chance to learn a new language for life. You can schedule digital delivery in advance so that a lifetime membership is sent to your loved one's inbox the day of the holiday you celebrate. Thanks so much to Rosetta Stone for partnering with me on this video, and now let's dive into more of the research behind 16th century Irish dress. So first of all, in modern times, the léine tends to be made with a ton of gathering or pleating at the neck. And this will usually go down to the shoulders with these drawstring things. But this doesn't seem to have historical evidence. This type of drawstring neck-to-wrist gathering doesn't even exist in the 16th century. Most likely, the léine was cut more like other smocks at this time. The idea that a ton of fabric needs to be gathered into a small amount of space perhaps comes from the fact that the léine was thought to have been made from around 7 yards or more of cloth. In 1537, King Henry VIII releases laws in the Statute of Irish Parliament to ban distinctly Irish forms of dress, and those include things like using more than 7 yards of cloth in a shirt or smock, the Irish brut, any garment dyed with saffron, and no woman can use or wear any kirtle or coat tucked up. And you'll see why this kind of distinction is important with Irish fashion later on. And these are just a few amongst a bunch of other horribly culturally oppressive restrictions. A few of the articles I was reading on the topic spoke of how the average loom width for weaving fabric at this time was 20 to 30 inches. So 7 yards of 20 to 30 inch wide fabric really isn't that much. It's kind of the average actually for similarly shaped medieval coats that I've made. But whilst 20 to 30 inch wide fabric widths could very much be the case in Ireland, or when talking about the léine in this context, I don't believe this is the case for everyone in the 16th century. I have definitely seen other looms from similar time periods, including earlier ones, with widths far wider than this. So it would have been possible also, I think, to weave a wider cloth, which I think is a common misconception, that people in early history were limited by narrow loom widths. When in reality, I think the truth is a lot more nuanced than that. A 20 to 30 inch wide loom could certainly be a comfortable size to work by hand, but excavations of loom beams from the abandoned by the 14th century farm beneath the sand settlement of present-day Greenland and other finds from Iceland possess a weaving space measuring from 50 to 64 inches. And this is just a few examples. Many other examples of looms capable of weaving cloth wider than 30 inches exist throughout history. So yes, maybe the léine was made from 20 to 30 inch wide hand-woven linen, which could be why 7 yards of fabric is interpreted as a massive amount. Yet 7 yards of 30 inch wide fabric is not much different than 3.5 yards of our modern day 60 inch wide fabric. For women, on top of the léine would be worn a gúna, which is a dress quite similar to Tudor kirtles of this time. I'll be speaking more about their distinct features and characteristics later on in this video, as well as talking more about the final component of this entire ensemble, which is the brut. As with all of the garments I make, this entire ensemble is going to be completely hand-stitched, and I also decided to experiment a little bit deeper with another aspect of historical accuracy, which you'll see in a little bit. It was a lot of fun, and now I'm definitely obsessed with this new hobby and new type of textile art, so there will be probably more to come. I also have a theory about the léine sleeves being a bit different for women than men, which I'll explain later too. And since I'm utilizing these Heere illustrations as my primary visual reference, the clothing I'll be reconstructing is that of wealthier Irish people. It is likely that poorer Irish people would have dressed more as he depicted in this plate instead. Dunlevy writes, "Illustrations of the time suggest that wool was the principal textile used by the less well-off. The Heere's poor woman is depicted in a loose smock with an apron, mantle, and head covering. Although scantily clothed and therefore impoverished in the eyes of many, it is clear that she would have had status within her own community. From fragments of similar clothing found in bogs, it would seem likely that her chemise was of a soft, loosely woven fine wool." Page 59. So now that you know a bunch of details about 16th century Irish dress, let's go and make the garments.
The very first garment that I made was the brot, which is also known as a mantle in English. These were typically made of wool and semicircular, but of course I realized that they were semicircular after I had already finished making mine. So mine is a giant rectangle. I didn't bother redoing the project because I was already done with it, but just know for historical accuracy that this should have been semicircular. It took a couple of days to stitch it all on, as my brot is about 3 meters by 1¼ meters. Once my brot was complete, I decided to begin working on the gúna. For the gúna, I strived for this pink coral color that you see here in Heere's illustration. For this project, I really wanted to natural dye as much of the fabric as I could. I only have experience dyeing materials with tannins and not with plant dyes themselves, so it was a bit of a learning curve, but thanks to the help of various internet resources, I was able to figure things out. I decided madder root would be the most reasonable option to achieve this shade, and also the most historically viable for Ireland in the 16th century. I took this beautiful white hand-woven wool and got it ready for dyeing by pre-washing it. I took some water below 60 degrees Celsius and added some soda ash to make it harder, and then I mixed in my madder powder and let it boil for some hours. At this point, I probably should have strained off the excess powder, but I didn't. And since this is my first time working with plant dyes, I sort of predicted that there would be things that didn't go the way I intended and would be learning experiences. And this was indeed the case, and at some points it was a little bit stressful. As I was setting the wool fabric into the dye pot, I realized it was probably too small of a pot, so I ended up having to cut 1 meter of it off. This dye pot is even an incredibly large vessel, but wool is so bulky, especially this type of fulled wool. So I'm dyeing this wool fabric right now with madder powder, and I honestly have no idea what I am doing. I'm just kind of trying it out. I think there are some problems, which is that my dye pot, first of all, is probably not big enough for the amount of wool that I'm dyeing. I predict that it might end up kind of blotchy. This might turn out okay. It might be a flop. It's a big experiment. I'm just gonna do my best because the white fabric's already in the dye bath, so there's not really any going back now, is there? So this would have also happened historically, I suppose. Some people probably would have had blotchy dye on their fabrics, especially if they weren't super knowledgeable about dyeing and they did it at home. Now I'm just waiting for it to soak at this temperature for about 40 minutes. I think it's just around 60 degrees Celsius, and that will hopefully give a nice corally color instead of changing into browns. Again, we'll see. It might change into browns, who knows. Natural dyeing is an art of its own, and it requires a lot of trial and error. This is my first time working with madder, so I'm gonna do my best, see how it turns out, and see what happens. Once I accepted that my dye pot was probably too small and my fabric would likely be blotchy, I let the wool sit in the bath for a while until it turned the color I wanted. Then came the ridiculously difficult part, trying to rinse the dye out of 4 meters of wet fulled wool. My entire body was so sore because I had to use every muscle for this task. After many hours of rinsing and also putting the wool into the washing machine, I managed to get most of the dye off of the fabric. Well, hi everyone, it's the next day, and the fabric actually turned out better than I expected. It's pretty blotchy because I simply did not have a big enough dye pot. So I'll show you all what ended up happening. It's this really pretty coral color, and that's what I was going for. As you can see, there's some areas where it's like a slightly darker coral, like in this part around here, but it's actually really nice and I'm quite happy with how it turned out. I also think it's very much in line with the color of what I was expecting, and there are some sections like at the bottom where it's quite evenly dyed. So I'm going to utilize those sections for the bodice portion of the dress, of the gúna, and then I'm going to use the more blotchy parts for the really heavily gathered section, because then I feel like it'll be less noticeable because it'll just seem like shadows playing with the fabric. For the pattern, I took the self-drafted 14th century kirtle that I made a few years back. I love working with this pattern. It fits me really well and I have really managed to perfect the design over time. Since the gúna in the illustration sort of looks like some Tudor-style gowns, having a kirtle-like laced body that ends at the waist and then a very pleated or gathered skirt, I figured I could utilize the top portion of my kirtle pattern and then stop it at the waist, and then I could make some adjustments to the neckline, and then I could cut the skirt pieces out separately as giant rectangles. So I've made quite a lot of progress on this bodice, I would say. I had to change the neckline to make it a lot lower because in the photos they are not as high as some of my original kirtle necklines for the medieval period. I tend to block out the neckline a lot higher because then if I want to use it for something later on that's a lot lower neckline, all I have to do is cut into the fabric rather than having to redraft or extend the neckline or something or cut the fabric again, which, you know, is really annoying. So it's better, I think, to just add more and then take away if you need it. So that's what I've done here. I'll show you all comparing the two sides together so you can see what I mean. There's a spider on me. Hello, little guy. Hi. You wanna get off? Okay. Bye. I love spiders. So cute. This is the original neckline, and you can see just how high it is. It literally reaches to about my chest bone here. So obviously in the photos, the neckline is more to here, like right above the start of the bust. So because of that, I've shortened it quite a bit, and you can see the updated version here. And so far, I am incredibly happy with the fit. I think it looks incredibly good. I also increased the space in the front because in all the photos the opening is slightly open, so you kind of need things to be a little too tight so that way you'll have a little bit of a gap there, which is what I ended up doing. So normally I would have the kirtle lace up all the way and close completely, but in the examples of the illustrations that I'm referencing, you can see there's a little bit of a gap in the front. So that's what I'm going for. Everything that needs to be fitting well is fitting well. It hits me exactly at the waist point, which is what we want. And actually it's even a tiny bit higher, which is good because the skirt is actually going to weigh down the fabric a little bit. So I wanted to make it just a tiny bit higher. The back is looking super good. Everything is smooth and laying nicely. This is definitely one of the best fitting kirtles that I've made, but it's also because I've been using this self-drafted kirtle pattern for a couple of years now, so I've been able to really perfect it over time. When I started sewing 5 years ago, I could have never imagined that I would get to the point of being able to self-draft complex garments like these, especially tightly fitted kirtles and gúnas and other garments. But yeah, it's incredible what happens when you devote thousands of hours to a skill and just getting better and better and better at it over time. At first, I was going to leave the entire gúna unlined, but I kept on noticing that in the illustrations, when the Irish women lift their skirts up to reveal another dress underneath, you can see a different color. This meant that at least the skirts would have been lined. You can also see this referenced in Henry VIII's oppressive laws against Irish people that I read in the introduction. I assumed perhaps they may have been lined with another layer of wool, as you sometimes see this in lined medieval hoods or cloaks. I think that this separate dress underneath is actually not the léine, but perhaps one additional tight-fitted layer that would have been worn under the gúna, but I've not managed to see reference for it anywhere, so I decided to skip it, and instead, I guess I could fold it up so that the léine would be seen underneath, though because the léine is technically my underwear, this would perhaps, at least by English standards at the time, be seen as blasphemous. But then again, they already thought my Irish ancestors were blasphemous for other reasons, so what's new? I had just enough of this rich blue fold wool to line the gúna skirt with it, and I did so with little prick stitches so you couldn't see the thread much on the outside. I decided for the pleating to go with cartridge pleating as I felt that this would give the most elegant look, especially since I don't have tons of fabric to work with. I just went ahead and made these by eye as I've been trying to rely more on my instinct and less on measuring with certain sewing techniques. I also think a lot of the time historically cartridge pleating would have been done by eye because in general pleating was not a math, it was more of an art. So people usually did them by feel rather than by a formula. For the sleeves, I utilized a self-drafted pattern for my medieval surcoat as a starting point, and then I narrowed them significantly so that they would mimic the open sleeves that you see in the illustrations. Having experimented now with wearing detachable sleeves a lot in my everyday life, I truly do think that they are the most amazing thing ever because they don't connect at the underarm, so you never have to do the underarm seam repair, which is so incredibly common with wearing historical fashion every day. I had a suspicion that perhaps this is why the Irish women's 16th century sleeve was also open in this way, in addition to them being able to still show off some of the beautiful drape of the unique bagpipe léine sleeves. In Dunlevy's Dress in Ireland book, the author does mention the unique strip sleeves and writes, "These strips were worn over chemise sleeves of linen, silk, or satin, and no thing was worn on the hinder part of the arm, lest it was said they should wear out their elbows," from page 48. In the illustrations, the sleeves appear to me to be tied to the wrist with some type of linen tape or band. So I did this for my own sleeves, except I used cotton tape, don't tell anyone, because I don't have any linen tape, but it'll pass. And they seem to be adorned in the illustration with these little white balls. At first I thought maybe they're giant pearls, but then I realized how ridiculously expensive that would have been in the 16th century, so I thought perhaps something like colored glass could have been used. I decided to opt for large beads made of quartz, as quartz was a mineral readily available in 16th century Ireland. I'm not super knowledgeable about mining and mineral history, so I'm not sure how expensive it would have been to acquire quartz in 16th century Ireland, but I do know it at least existed and it produces the white color like you see in the illustrations. If you happen to be familiar with quartz prices in 16th century Ireland, please do feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Now, I want to be able to wear this gúna in my everyday life because I don't just want to make these outfits for one video and then shove them in a closet. I actually want to be able to integrate them into my everyday historical wardrobe. Therefore, I felt to make this garment more versatile for this purpose, I would have the sleeves be pin-on sleeves. That way I could wear the gúna afterwards with or without the sleeves depending on what I wanted. The final step was to make all the eyelets for the gúna. I needed to keep to a somewhat tight schedule, so I managed to get these all done in 24 hours, and now I feel like I never want to sew another eyelet again, but I'm sure that feeling will pass in a couple months, and in fact it will have to because I am about to make another kirtle. I'm going to have to get over it. Once the brot and the gúna were done, it was time for the final piece, the léine, which we spoke so much about earlier. Sometimes the léine would have been dyed yellow with plant materials, often referred to as saffron yellow. But saffron at this time, and even today let's be honest, is super expensive. So potentially only the wealthiest could have dyed fabric with it. But with plant dyes, yellow is actually one of the easiest colors to obtain. There are many different plants which can produce it, some of which were readily available in 16th century Ireland and also inexpensive. One such plant is weld, or dyer's rocket. For my own léine, I decided to experiment with weld for the first time. You may have noticed that in our reference illustration, the Irish woman is wearing a white léine. Léines were also sometimes white, and there aren't illustrations of women wearing yellow ones. However, we know they did because of a primary source, which is Francesco Chiricate's letter to Isabella d'Este Gonzaga from 1516. He writes, "The women are very beautiful and very fair, but slovenly. They wear the same saffron shirts." The rest of the letter and what he describes is not very nice, to be honest, as you may have guessed by the fact that he's already called Irish women slovenly. But at least we have some evidence for the saffron shirt being worn by women due to this letter. So in order to dye my linen with plant dye, it's actually a little complicated and certainly not as straightforward as dyeing wool. You first have to prime your linen with a mordant to get the dye to hold well, but in order to get the mordant to hold well, you have to dye the fabric with a tannin. So it's a 3-step process. I'm making my léine from this gorgeous hand-woven linen that's just perfect for this project. I pre-washed it as it was already ready for dyeing, and I soaked it for about 24 hours in a whopping 800 grams of green tea, which I then steeped in water. I was a little bit tempted to drink a sip, but I figured it's my dye pot, and it's a lot of caffeine, so probably better not. Oak galls would have been one of the more common tannins at this point in time, and since I needed a light colored tannin as to not affect the end result of the dye color very much, but I couldn't get access to oak galls, I used green tea as it has a very similar effect. I made sure the dye bath temperature didn't get above 60 degrees Celsius, as this can start to impact the color that you get, so in general this was my rule of thumb throughout the whole process. Then, once I gave the fabric a rinse, it was time to work with the mordant. I added in some alum along with soda ash to make the water even more hard, as well tends to bind better to the fabric with hard water, and I let this soak for another 36 hours. Then I gave it all a rinse. Finally, it was actually time for the weld. I first poured hot water over the raw material and let it sit overnight. Then I brewed the raw material into water just below 60 degrees Celsius for several hours until I was happy with the strength of the extract. Finally, I drained all the liquid from the raw material, separating them, basically so that my linen wouldn't end up blotchy, because whenever it comes into contact with bits of the raw material, it can end up leaving little stains of darker color. I set the linen into the dye bath and let it soak overnight. I washed everything the next day and hung it up to dry, and in the end, it resulted in this gorgeous and vibrant yellow color. It was a success, and I honestly could not have been happier with the result.
You guys, I'm sick today. I don't even care, because look how beautiful this linen turned out. I cannot believe I dyed this. Look how beautiful it turned out. It's such a gorgeous color, and I'm so happy, and it's incredibly even. There's not any blotching from what I can tell. Now it's time to go and pattern the léine and cut it out and start the sewing. And I'm really excited to make these beautiful sleeves, because that I feel like is really the main staple of the garment, is the sleeve shape. So I can't wait to make it.
For the construction of the léine itself, I followed quite a similar shape to the medieval smock or shift, or even the coat. I started by drafting the unique and characteristic bagpipe sleeves. I took some basic measurements, like the length from where the sleeve would begin to my wrist, as well as generally how wide I would want the sleeve to be, both at the widest and the narrowest point. And then I drafted out the design, freehand drawing the curvature of the bagpipe sleeve. As I mentioned earlier, it's a misconception that the léine has the drawstring gathered sleeves that you often see in modern recreations. I can't show any photos because they're all copyright, but just look up léine on the internet and you'll see what I mean. There is no historical evidence for this, so I of course skipped it for my own reconstruction. But looking at the illustrations and how the sleeves fall, I ended up coming up with a theory. I truly do feel like there is some gathering at the sleeve head, even if it's just a little bit, to get it to fall in this way, where you see the wrinkles coming down. You can see how there's creases in the fabric down to the wrist. In the 16th century, you really start to see gathered sleeves in fashion, so this doesn't feel that far-fetched to me. In Italy, you get the camicia, an undergarment which has prominent gathered sleeves, or you can see smocked shirts in the 16th century. One of the first steps in smocking is to run gathering threads, so this says to me that the skill existed already in Europe in this time period, and it was fairly widespread. That's why even though so many reconstructions of the léine don't include a gathered sleeve head, I decided to for my own because it actually felt more plausible. I think a lot of the people doing reconstructions are reconstructing the male's léine, which does differ from the females. I mean, the sleeve, for instance, is about half as long. It doesn't go down to the wrist, it stops at the elbow. So it wouldn't surprise me then if the female léine followed more of the Italian fashions, or maybe some of the fashions in continental Europe, because also the gúna is following other traditions throughout European fashion at the time, so it doesn't feel far-fetched to me that they would kind of blend the style of the traditional léine with more of the gathered sleeve style that you see in the 16th century. To me, it also looks like in the images of the women's léine, the cuff is gathered, and I ended up skipping this because I wanted to see how it was without the cuff and wrist gathering, and also I couldn't quite figure out how I was going to make it gather down and then attach it into the cuff and also keep the shape of the bagpipe sleeve. It just felt like something that my brain was not ready to engineer, so I decided to just leave it like this, but I do think the original ones had a cuff. You can kind of see it here in the illustration. For the body of the léine, I drew a big rectangle with the fold at the shoulders and left some extra seam allowance in case I felt like it wasn't wide enough when I tried it on. Finally, I used the rest of the linen to cut out 4 gores to set into the sides. I have seen other people make the léine with the center front and back gores like you tend to see with 14th or 15th century medieval coats or tunics. I can't see a line where the center back or front gore would be, which makes me think that it has side gores only and not a center back and front gore. And maybe there were no gores at all originally, maybe it was just cut at a very steep angle. For the neckline, I cut it quite low so that it would peek out just a little bit above the neckline of the gúna for a pop of yellow. I stitched all the pieces together, hemmed the garment, and it was ready to go. For my hair and makeup, it was common for unmarried females to wear their hair loose and long, as well as in braids, and a fillet might be worn as well. For this depiction, I wanted to do something other than the headwear of the illustrations, so I've decided to portray an unmarried woman. For married women, their hair was always covered in public, as is the case throughout much of 16th century Europe. For makeup, I won't be wearing any. To get dressed, I started with my léine as the base layer, and then I put on the gúna over top with spiral lacing. For accessories, I decided not to wear any shoes and just put on my hose that I knitted. But sometimes for shoes, Irish people at the time were also very fond of going barefoot. I just wouldn't dare go barefoot on the internet. This wasn't always a sign of poverty for them, though it could have been related to poverty for some. The Irish people in the 16th century would also sometimes wear a shoe called broga, which just means shoes in Irish. But not a lot is known about these, so for my own look, I decided just to cover my bare feet and wear these hose that I knitted. I also have a beautiful tablet woven belt, which in Ireland at the time is called a crios. According to Dunlevy, this was typically 3 meters in length and tablet woven, and my belt meets both of those criteria. I also hung a small leather bag at the end of the belt towards the floor to mimic what you see in the illustration. I think this is meant to serve as almost like a sporan or a pocket. And finally, for jewelry, I have this small replica of a cross from medieval times, which looks quite similar to the one you can see in the reference illustration. Finally, in the illustration, you can see some type of fine scarf. In this case, since the women are wearing white léines, their scarves are yellow. And I decided to hem a giant triangle of a lightweight wool to make a sort of white scarf to wear underneath the léine. Now that I had all my components together, the look was complete, and it was time to film the final reveal. So this is what my outfit ended up looking like. I don't know how I feel about the fillet on me, to be honest. I feel like it's almost giving me kind of 90s workout vibes a little bit, but that's okay. I think it would look much nicer actually if I had my hair up, or maybe if it had a little bit more ornamentation on it, or maybe if it was made of a thinner material. But overall, I'm incredibly happy with this look. It's definitely something I'm gonna wear in my own life, and I just cannot believe that I plant dyed these fabrics. The color is so beautiful. I never knew that this gorgeous coral and yellow color would go so well together, but it does. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next week for another video, because all of November I'm posting a video every week. And if you would like to see me and my best friend Devin camp on a medieval mattress for an entire week, be sure to watch this video next.